She said it was an accident. The evidence said murder. They were married for just 12 days when Hannah called 911, breathless and panicked. "My husband fell off a cliff," she said, but something in her voice didn't sound broken. Ethan Moore and Hannah Keller were that couple. Storybook love, picture-perfect smiles, and the kind of chemistry that made strangers envy them in restaurants. Their Instagram feed looked like a travel magazine. Sunrise hikes, candlelit dinners, handwritten notes tucked into luggage, and captions filled with inside jokes only they seemed to understand. They had met 3 years earlier in Charleston, South Carolina, at a coffee shop of all places. She spilled a latte on his laptop. He laughed. She apologized a dozen times. He asked her to dinner instead of suing her. By the third date, they were inseparable. Friends described Ethan as grounded, soft-spoken, the kind of man who thought long before he spoke. A mechanical engineer who loved rock climbing, maps, and mornings. Hannah, on the other hand, was pure fire, quick-witted, social, and ambitious. She was an aspiring content creator who could turn a weekend trip into a 10-minute vlog with 1,000 likes. They balanced each other, at least on the surface. When they got engaged, it wasn't a surprise. Neither was the wedding. It was small, elegant, filled with fairy lights, mason jars, and handwritten vows. Asheville was a perfect spot, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, close to the forest they loved to hike and far from city noise. Just days after the ceremony, they packed their bags for their honeymoon. No fancy resorts, no international flights, just a cozy mountain cabin, a rental Jeep, and plans to explore the trails that curved through waterfalls, cliffs, and quiet lake views. Ethan wanted peace. Hannah wanted content. They agreed on both. She would film. He would build campfires. They'd sleep under stars and wake up to misty mornings. Friends say Hannah had been unusually quiet the night before the trip, a little distant, but no one thought much of it. Post-wedding fatigue, maybe. They checked into a rustic Airbnb just outside Boone, North Carolina. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, a fire pit, and a wraparound porch with rocking chairs that face the hills. It was the kind of place people book for anniversaries. The kind of place that usually end with toasts and memories. Neighbors saw them arrive late in the evening, laughing, holding hands. Nothing seemed off. If there was tension, it didn't show. But behind closed doors, no one knows what really happened in that cabin over the next 2 days. And when Ethan Moore disappeared on the third morning, it would take nearly a week and a trail of buried secrets to understand what truly went wrong. On the morning of May 12th, the sun rose over the Blue Ridge Mountains just like any other. It was a clear, crisp day, the kind that lures hikers and honeymooners to the winding trails and scenic overlooks. Around 8:47 a.m., a 911 call came into Watauga County Dispatch. The voice on the other end was trembling, panicked, and breathless. "My husband, he slipped. He was taking a photo. He just fell. Please, he's not moving." The caller was identified as 27-year-old Hannah Keller. She was alone, standing on a popular trail near Ravens Peak Bluff, a rocky outcrop known for its sweeping views and steep, jagged drops. She claimed Ethan had been trying to capture the morning light over the valley when he lost his footing and went over the edge. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately. Within 45 minutes, park rangers, paramedics, and sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene. Hannah was found sitting near the cliff, knees pulled to her chest, face streaked with tears, hands shaking. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "It happened so fast. I didn't even see him go." But something about the scene didn't sit right. Veteran Ranger Thomas Jensen, who'd worked in those mountains for over 20 years, later said, "We've had falls before. Accidents happen. But this, it just fell off. Too clean. Too quiet." Ethan's body was located about 60 feet below the ledge, wedged between rocks and moss. At first glance, it looked consistent with a fall. Broken bones, blunt trauma. But the position of the body, it was unusual. Too far from the edge, too precisely placed, like he had been guided or pushed, not just fallen. Hannah was taken back to the ranger station for basic questioning, still in shock. She said Ethan had stepped backward while adjusting the camera on a tripod, that he lost his balance, that she screamed, that she didn't even have time to reach for him. But one detail stood out. She hadn't run down to try and help him. She hadn't moved from the spot. She didn't climb down, didn't scream for help. She just called. Deputy Miles Carter, one of the first on scene, later testified. It was like she'd rehearsed it. The panic felt mechanical. Her mascara wasn't even smudged. That stuck with me. Still, no arrests were made. No accusations were thrown. It was just another tragic accident in the mountains, at least for now. But investigators took note of something that would prove critical later. Her phone. While Hannah claimed she didn't use it until she called 911, her location history said otherwise. Her phone had paused, stationary, for nearly 18 minutes before she made the call. 18 minutes of silence. 18 minutes before she told the world that Ethan Moore was dead. When the coroner's report arrived 3 days after the fall, it cracked open a truth that no one at the scene had expected. Certainly not from a newlywed honeymoon gone wrong. At first glance, Ethan Moore's injuries could pass for fall-related trauma. His left wrist was fractured, several ribs broken, and there was bruising along his spine. But it was a wound on his head that stood out, a deep, clean gash above his right temple. The kind of injury that doesn't come from tumbling down a cliffside, but from being struck. Dr. Valerie Henson, the county medical examiner, was the first to question it. Her notes described the injury as linear, sharp-edged, localized, far more consistent with blunt force trauma delivered by an object, not a rock. If this was a fall, she wrote, it was an unusually deliberate one. Injuries from accidental falls, especially from that height, tend to be chaotic. Multiple abrasions, irregular wounds, defensive bruising from flailing arms. But Ethan's body told a different story. One of stillness, of no fight, no attempt to brace himself, no evidence of flinching. Then came the toxicology. Clean, no alcohol, no drugs, no medical conditions that could have caused disorientation or a misstep. He was healthy, alert, a man fully capable of standing his ground, unless someone else had taken that ground out from under him. The more investigators reviewed the evidence, the less it resembled an accident. The gash on his head was likely the first injury, meaning he was unconscious or dead before he ever went over the edge. And that changed everything. Back at the scene, detectives re-examined the overlook where Hannah claimed Ethan had fallen. They found a tripod she mentioned, but it was folded and leaning against a tree, and used. The ground near the ledge wasn't scuffed or disturbed. No drag marks, no sign of slipping. Just a perfect, empty space. Too perfect. Then came the trail of digital breadcrumbs, photos, videos, timestamps. Ethan hadn't taken a single picture that morning. His phone was in airplane mode, but Hannah's wasn't. Hers had pinged cell towers half a mile away, almost an hour before the fall. Investigators now had a working theory. Ethan had been struck from behind. He was either dead or unconscious when his body went over the edge. The fall was an accident. It was a cover-up. And the one person who claimed to be by his side the entire time was the only one whose version didn't match the evidence. The body had spoken, loudly, clearly, and it wasn't saying accident. While Hannah Keller's face appeared shattered in grief on the day of Ethan's death, her phone told a colder, far more calculated story. Investigators subpoenaed her digital records just 48 hours after the autopsy raised questions. And buried inside her iMessage threads, Instagram DMs, and deleted photo backups was a man named Caleb. Caleb Ross, 28. A name not mentioned in any of Hannah's initial interviews. A man not listed on the wedding guest list. A digital ghost until now. But within minutes of combing her history, he became impossible to ignore. They had dated back in college, briefly, according to her friends. But the messages told a different story. Their connection had never really ended. Over the last 6 months, Hannah and Caleb had exchanged hundreds of messages, many of them deleted but recovered from iCloud backups. Some flirtatious, some personal, some disturbing. But one stood out, a text dated just 3 days before she and Ethan left for the honeymoon. It read, "It's almost done, just like we said." It wasn't just the content. It was the timing, the tone, the confidence. Detectives flagged it immediately. Prosecutors would later call it the moment the murder plan became real. And there was more. She had sent him a photo the morning of the wedding, a mirror selfie in her dress. The caption read, "Last hurdle." Caleb had replied with a heart emoji. Investigators now had a potential motive. This wasn't crime or passion. It was premeditated, cold, controlled, calculated. If Hannah wanted out of the marriage, she could have walked, but she didn't. She married Ethan. She shared vows, cut cake, danced, and then, 12 days later, reported his death. Why? Money? Control? Love? The answer, perhaps, was in the third man in the shadows. Caleb wasn't just a former flame. He was recently divorced, financially stable. He had just moved to Chicago, a detail that seemed unimportant until they checked flight records and found Hannah had browsed tickets to Chicago just 2 days before Ethan's death. But the most damning evidence wasn't digital. It was emotional. Hannah's tone in those messages was confident, empowered, as if what she was about to do wasn't terrible, but necessary, as if she saw Ethan not as a husband, but as an obstacle. She had told detectives there was no one else, that Ethan was her world. But Caleb's name never once crossed her lips during hours of questioning. Now investigators had motive, means, and a growing web of lies. What began as a tragic fall was unraveling into a conspiracy. And at the center of it stood a woman who had rehearsed heartbreak like a role, and a man in the shadows who might have helped write the script. As investigators dug deeper into the events of that fateful day, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A hiker's GoPro camera left recording on a nearby trail. The footage, later recovered from the owner's lost bag, offered a window into the moments before tragedy struck, and it shattered Hannah's carefully crafted timeline. The video showed Ethan and Hannah walking along a narrow path overlooking the cliffs. At first, they appeared calm, even affectionate, exchanging smiles and light conversation. But then the tone shifted. Ethan was not near the cliff's edge as Hannah had claimed. Instead, the footage captured a heated argument, voices raised, gestures sharp and pointed. Ethan's face was tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Hannah's expression was equally intense, frustration, anger, and something colder, more calculated. This wasn't a couple enjoying their honeymoon. This was two people at a breaking point. The timestamp on the footage was 8:37 a.m., exactly 10 minutes before Hannah's 911 call. Why would Ethan, a man described by friends as calm and reserved, engage in a public argument with his new wife just minutes before his death? And why would Hannah choose this moment to call emergency services instead of immediately helping him when he supposedly fell? Detectives began reconstructing the timeline with painstaking detail. Phone GPS data, witness accounts, and the GoPro footage formed a conflicting picture, one that contradicted Hannah's version of a sudden accident. Further analysis showed that after the argument, Ethan was seen stepping back from the trail, away from the cliff. He was not taking pictures or admiring the view, but retreating from the confrontation. Hannah followed closely, her face tight with determination. The camera captured no sign of Ethan losing his footing or falling. No stumble, no slip, no sudden movements that would indicate an accident. Instead, the footage ended abruptly, as if the camera had been turned off or obscured. This silence raised new questions. If Ethan fell, why did no one capture it? Why was the last footage so carefully cut off? Witnesses later reported hearing raised voices and a sudden thud near the cliffside, but no screams or calls for help. One hiker, passing by minutes later, described the scene as eerily quiet, almost staged. This new evidence painted a picture of a relationship unraveling in the final moments, a confrontation that escalated, a moment of violence hidden behind a serene mountain backdrop. For the first time, the investigation was no longer about an unfortunate accident. It was about a fracture in trust, a breaking point, and a timeline cracked open by a single camera that refused to lie. A week after Ethan Moore's death, the quiet mountain town buzzed with shock and whispers. The story that once seemed like a tragic accident had turned into something far darker, something planned. On May 19th, Hannah Keller was taken into custody by Watauga County deputies. The charges, second-degree murder. A stunning twist that left friends and family reeling. Her arrest wasn't a surprise to investigators. Over days of intense interrogation, Hannah's calm demeanor cracked. The facade of the grieving wife slowly gave way to chilling admissions. She confessed. Hannah told detectives that she had planned the entire trip with a sinister purpose. The honeymoon wasn't about love or new beginnings. It was a stage set for a deadly act. She had rehearsed the fall repeatedly in her mind, imagining every detail. She knew exactly where Ethan would stand, how he would move, and when she pushed him, she expected no one to doubt it was an accident. But it wasn't just a moment of rage or passion. It was calculated, cold, to cover her tracks. She had coordinated with Caleb Ross, the man from her past who had become her accomplice. She ensured Caleb was out of state during the trip to provide an alibi. Texts recovered from their phones revealed coded messages, plans to stay safe and quiet until the dust settled. When asked why she did it, Hannah's answer sent a shiver through the interrogation room. Because Ethan didn't deserve to own me. Those words echoed like a verdict of their own. The small-town courthouse prepared for what would become a media frenzy. Reporters swarmed the halls as courtroom sketches captured Hannah's first appearance behind bars. Stoic, eyes downcast, a woman haunted by her own choices. Friends who once adored her struggled to reconcile the image of the vibrant, ambitious woman. They knew with the calculated killer the evidence painted. Legal experts speculated about the strength of the case. A confession, digital evidence, forensic reports, and that haunting GoPro footage. The prosecution's story was airtight. But questions lingered. Was Hannah the sole mastermind, or was Caleb more involved than anyone suspected? Would she take the stand, or plead guilty to avoid a harsher sentence? In the days following the arrest, the community grappled with the truth behind the perfect couple's facade. Social media erupted with debates, sympathy, and disbelief. Ethan's family demanded justice. Hannah's supporters called for understanding. One thing was clear. This was no longer just a tragic story of a honeymoon gone wrong. It was a brutal reminder of the secrets people hide behind smiles and vows. And as the case moved forward, everyone watched, waiting to see how the rest of this chilling true crime saga would unfold. The trial began 3 months after Hannah Keller's arrest. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but the atmosphere was electric. Reporters packed benches. Ethan's parents sat in the front row, and Caleb Ross was nowhere to be found. Hannah entered wearing a muted gray jumpsuit, wrists shackled, but her face, calm, unreadable. And when the prosecution laid out the evidence, the texts, the phone records, the GoPro footage, she didn't flinch. In fact, once she smiled, as if the outcome had already been decided. Prosecutors painted her as cold, manipulative, obsessed with freedom and control. Her defense? She claimed emotional abuse, that she felt trapped. That Caleb was just a listener, not a co-conspirator. But even her own testimony felt rehearsed, hollow. The jury didn't buy it. After just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Hannah Keller was sentenced to 40 years in prison. No possibility of parole for the first 28. Outside the courthouse, Ethan's sister spoke through tears. My brother didn't die in an accident. He was betrayed by someone he trusted completely. But the real damage, the invisible kind, can't be measured in court dates or sentence lengths. The loss of Ethan Moore left a void that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. A love story, twisted into tragedy. A honeymoon turned horror. And while the mountains of North Carolina remain as beautiful as ever, those who remember what happened on that quiet trail will never see them the same again. The fall ended Ethan's life, but it was the truth that buried Hannah's.